So let me start with you, Étienne, and a first perspective when we look at the Brics, and especially, I would say, the development of the Brics. You saw this chart which I had laid out with G20, with G7, with the EU. From your perspective, what does this development of the Brics has as an impact for other international institutions, for other countries? Looking at it deliberately first from the outside on.
So, Nicolas, thank you very much for the introduction and this very prevalent question. Permettez-moi aussi vous adresser en français pour remercier, pour pouvoir adresser cette conférence aujourd'hui. I continue now in English, of course, as this is only English. Quite arguably, yes, we have seen a decrease in Western influence, a steady decrease over the last 15 years. In fact, if you look at it, started all with Lehman Brothers, and since then we see a bit of a decline in the relevance of, and if we are honest, we have to admit it, of G7, G20 has been on the rise a bit, European Union a bit less influential. Where can we track that down? Where can we see this impact? We have to be very open and frank with ourselves. We were under different assumptions when we imposed the sanctions against Russia in 2022. It was a very clear understanding that within a few months the Russian economy would be in shatters. It is not. So is it a failure? No. Was it a mistake? No. It was necessary to impose sanctions on Russia after its war of aggression against Ukraine. There was no alternative from a standpoint of international law. You cannot just stand by and do nothing. But what was the expectation? It was that Russia would more or less be on its knees within a few months because the rest of the world would follow us in imposing sanctions because they could not afford not to impose sanctions. But quite honestly, half of the world has not followed us on this path of imposing sanctions. So this leads us to an evaluation of where we stand and where we should continue going. And one of the main lessons to be drawn for the West, for the G7, for the European Union is not to continue to lament this decline in influence, which also is a bit something that we have to blame on ourselves. We have a lackluster economic performance. We have political domestic crisis in many European countries, difficulties in forming governments, not only in France, also in my country. It takes some time. So it is not unsurmountable. These are challenges. This is normal. But of course, this leads to a decline in influence and the perception in other parts of the world that, yes, in fact, they are less influential, less important. So, and as your charts have shown, there have been shifts in shares of GDP in the population they represent, 45% the Brics, in the raw earths that are to be found in Brics countries. Brazil has pointed it out at its speech, the Kazan summit, that quite arguably a large percentage of the rare minerals and earths are to be found in Brics countries, important for the energy transition. So, what do we do now? We must engage in a dialogue with Brics countries and not lecture them. And we should listen to them and their concerns. If, for example, our host country tells us, listen, the Brics for us is a geo-economic project, we should accept it as such and start a dialogue on the basis of this being a geo-economic project meant at economic diversification. And the UAE is very good at economic diversification and at implementing CEPAs, their free trade agreements. They want to do some with the European Union as well. So maybe we should also take the hand that is extended to us as a European Union and agree on starting negotiations also with the UAE on a CEPA. That would help, for example, to engage bilaterally. What would also help is to invite Brics leaders, as has been done this year already by Italy, to G7 summits. Like if you give them also a place at the big seats, this will help by also listening to what they have to say, and it would be easier to get them on board because they are all ready for, with the exception, of course, of Russia, on a dialogue on sanctions against Russia, on dual-use items, on how to bring about peace. So that should be something that we should really focus on as well in the future. And this leads us to the other point that at the end of the day, yes, we have seen a decline in our influence, but that's not irreversible. We can also read the Draghi report, read many other reports that are out about how to increase, and this is something you are an expert on, how to increase competitiveness, how to tap into the potential of AI. We as Europe, we are nowhere to be seen on AI. We have no AI champions. They are to be found in Asia and in the US, not in Europe. That is a problem. We can solve that. We can do that. If we are successful in that, we will be of more relevance and more importance. The EU is seeking an alliance with the US on AI. Not so much with Europe. There is a reason for that. And at the end, we should be a bit careful with threats issued against the BRICS, as President-elect Trump has made clear a week ago on Twitter or on X, that if ever they should implement an alternative to the dollar, there will be 100% tariffs. So far, there haven't been any concrete plans to implement a currency on the BRICS level. But if we continue to threaten them, maybe we will give them the idea that they should do that and even trade more among the BRICS, as we've outlined, and create their own financial system to immunize themselves from sanctions. Yes. So we should be careful that it doesn't backfire, and I will stop here.
Yeah. No, but I think it's very interesting what you say in terms of having this dialogue with the BRICS countries. I think, you mentioned the 100% tariff threat, which I think was, again, part of a tactical policy, but I think it's definitely not an example of a dialogue. I think the question of how to join forces with the BRICS countries plays an important role. Thank you for your first intervention.